Don't tell the bride.
At my own wedding, my mother-in-law made everyone think I was lying.
You didn't defend me from your mother's humiliation, and I'm sorry, I didn't know how to handle it. I'll make it right, I promise.
The room was full. The bride was standing right there. And still, someone leaned in and whispered something she wasn't meant to hear. Don't tell the bride. No one reacted. No one warned her. Because in that moment, everyone knew something, and she was the only one who didn't. That wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. At a wedding, silence is supposed to protect the bride. But that day, silence chose a side. And standing there in white, she realized something terrifying. What she didn't know was already being used against her.
I'm Emily Carter. I've spent years planning weddings and witnessing what happens when respect is taken away in front of an audience. And if you're already here, let me know where you're watching from. Now, let's begin.
The church was holding its breath when it happened. I was standing just off to the side of the aisle, hands folded around a clipboard that suddenly felt heavier than it should. Watching a room full of people pretend they weren't nervous. Savannah does elegance like a performance-polished pews, soft light filtering through old glass. Flowers arranged so perfectly they almost looked expensive enough to justify the silence around them. Everything was aligned. Everything was controlled. And then Vivian Prescott leaned forward, just enough to break the symmetry, and said it clear, audible, unmistakably public. Don't tell the bride. No gasp followed. No immediate reaction, just that strange, communal pause where everyone hears the same thing and instantly wonders if they were supposed to. Was it a joke? A mistake? Or something we had all just been invited into without consent? I've planned weddings for years, and I can tell you this with certainty. Rituals are fragile. They look solid, but they're built on agreement, not stone. The moment someone breaks the script, the whole thing starts to wobble. And this wasn't a whisper. This was a statement dropped into the middle of a sacred exchange, like a coin into a crystal glass, maul, sharp, impossible to ignore. Madeline was still smiling when it happened. That kind of smile brides wear when they're holding themselves upright with sheer will. She didn't hear the words directly, not at first, but she felt them. You always do. How could she not, when half the room stiffened and the other half suddenly found the floor fascinating? I watched her eyes flicker, just slightly, scanning faces. What did they hear that I didn't? Why is everyone looking at me like I missed a step? And here's the cruel part: Vivian didn't need to explain. She didn't need to accuse Bi saying don't tell. She told everyone enough. When someone says there's a secret, the secret stops being private. It becomes a currency, passed silently from glance to glance. People think power is loud. It isn't. Power is knowing you can say very little and still tilt the room in your favor. Vivian knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't clumsiness. It was placement. Like nudging a chess piece and letting everyone else imagine the checkmate. I remember thinking, how much does a moment like this cost? Not in money though, weddings bleed that easily, but in dignity, in safety. In the invisible contract that says the altar is a place where no one gets ambushed. Vivian spent that currency without hesitation, and Madeline was the one left holding the deficit. Was there really something being hidden? And if so, why announce the hiding instead of the truth? More importantly, why here? Why now? Why in front of everyone who would remember this forever? In that instant, the ceremony stopped being about love and became about control, about who gets to speak and who is expected to endure. I've learned that when a celebration turns into a question mark, it doesn't quietly return to normal. It waits, it grows heavier, and sooner or later, someone has to answer it. Before that sentence fractured the air, everything looked flawless, dangerously so. I remember thinking how much effort had gone into making this wedding feel effortless. The kind of elegance that hides its labor, the way old money hides anxiety. The church in Savannah had seen generations of vows, and that morning it carried itself like it expected another quiet success. Soft organ notes, measured footsteps, guests dressed in colors chosen not to offend. Even tension, when it existed, were good manners. Madeline walked down the aisle like someone who had rehearsed calm, not stiff, not naive, prepared. She had the posture of a woman who knew this moment was being watched and judged and archived forever. Thomas stood waiting, shoulders squared, the expression of a man convinced that whatever storms existed were already behind them. From the outside, it read as certainty. From closer up, it read as control. And Vivian Prescott Shea was seated exactly where she wanted to be. Not front and center, not hidden, observing, measuring. I've seen that posture before. It's the stance of someone who believes history will eventually prove them right. So they don't rush. Respectable, patient, dangerous in its stillness. People assume weddings begin at the altar. They don't. They begin in all the conversations that never happened. All the compromises labeled as keeping the peace. This one was no different. There had always been a quiet resistance between Vivian and Madeline, the kind that doesn't explode, but erodes. Polite smiles stretched thin, compliments that landed with just enough weight to bruise, approval offered conditionally, like a loan with interest. I noticed how Madeline's family leaned forward slightly as she passed, pride mixed with vigilance. How Vivian didn't lean at all. How Thomas didn't look toward his mother, not avoidance exactly, more like habit. What does it mean when peace depends on silence? And how long can silence pretend to be harmony before it demands payment? As a planner, I'm trained to spot imbalance. Who paid for what? Who feels owed? Money leaves fingerprints on emotion, and this wedding carried them everywhere. Floral arrangements chosen to impress, guest lists negotiated like treaties. When people invest heavily, they expect influence. And Vivian had invested far more than she was willing to admit. Standing there, before the fracture, the room felt like a stage set to carefully Daru. Every smile was in place, every ritual cue hit on time. The kind of balance that doesn't come from trust, but from mutual agreement not to touch certain subjects. I remember thinking, this looks stable, but it's performative. And performative stability collapses the moment someone forgets their line. Madeline didn't know yet what she was about to be excluded from. But even before the words were spoken, the structure was already strained. You could feel it in the way the air resisted movement, in how no one fully exhaled. The celebration was standing on silence, like a thin sheet of ice, and all it needed was one deliberate step. And Vivian was already leaning forward. The silence after the words was louder than any organ note. It spread in waves, not all at once, first the front pews, then the side aisles, then the back rows, where people leaned in, as if proximity might explain what context refused to. I watched the moment take shape. How discomfort reorganizes a room. Conversations didn't stop because there were none to stop. What halted was movement, breath, certainty. Madeline turned her head just slightly, enough to notice that something had passed between people without her permission. She hadn't been told anything, yet she was already positioned as the one who didn't know. Isn't that the sharpest kind of exclusion? To realize you're the subject of a sentence you never heard spoken to you. Guests began exchanging glances, the kind that pretend to be neutral but never are. Someone knew something, someone else thought they did. And suddenly, the bride, center of the ritual, reason for the gathering, was the only person without access to whatever invisible file had just been opened in the room. Vivian remained still. No clarification, no follow-up. That was the strategy. Silence doesn't just withhold information, it redirects power. By refusing to explain, she forced everyone else to fill the gaps themselves. And people are far more creative and cruel than facts. I could almost see the questions forming over Madeline's head like smoke. What am I missing? Why won't anyone look at me directly? Is this about me? Or about him? Or worse, about something everyone thinks I hid? When you're left out of your own narrative, your mind doesn't default to innocence. It defaults to fear. This is what people misunderstand about public insinuation. You don't need to accuse you, just need to suggest that there's something shameful enough to be hidden. That suggestion alone rewrites the social contract. Madeline wasn't being confronted. She was being positioned quietly, efficiently as a problem. And here's the cruel efficiency of it all. The ceremony had to continue. The ritual didn't pause to accommodate her confusion. Vows don't wait for clarity. So she stood there, dressed in white, carrying a weight she hadn't agreed to pick up, while everyone else wondered if they were witnessing the beginning of an unraveling. I've seen couples argue over budgets, over guest lists, over who controls the microphone at the reception. But this was different. This was control without confrontation. A secret weaponized not by its content, but by its timing. Why say it then, if not to ensure maximum exposure? Why say it at all, if not to ensure the bride felt smallest at the exact moment she was supposed to feel protected? The silence pressed down harder with each passing second, and I could tell Madeline could tell that no one was going to rescue her from it. No explanation was coming, no apology. The implication had already done its work, and now the room was waiting to see what she would do with the burden it had placed on her shoulders. Some silences are temporary. This one wasn't. It had teeth. And it wasn't going to let go on its own. Vivian didn't move to fix what she had broken. That's how I knew it was intentional. She sat there composed, hands folded neatly in her lap, face calm in a way that suggested patience rather than regret. Not the posture of someone who misspoke, but of someone who believed the room would eventually settle around her version of events. She didn't rush to explain, because explanation would weaken the effect. Control works best when it's quiet. Madeline noticed it too. I saw the shift in her, not outwardly dramatic, just a tightening, like someone realizing the ground beneath them wasn't solid anymore. She looked toward Vivian, searching for something resembling reassurance. None came. That absence spoke louder than any accusation could have. What kind of person disrupts a wedding and then refuses to clean up the mess? Someone who understands hierarchy, someone who believes that the altar, like every other space, can be used to establish dominance. Vivian wasn't challenging the marriage directly. She was challenging Madeline's right to feel secure within it. And the brilliance, if you can call cruelty, brilliant, was in the restraint. No raised voice, no tears, no visible hostility. Just the implication left to ferment. By staying calm, Vivian framed herself as reasonable, even concerned. By staying silent, she forced Madeline into the role of the emotional one, should she react at all. I've learned that power often hides behind manners, especially in families where appearances are treated like assets. This wasn't about love or protection or even truth. It was about reminding everyone, especially the bride, who held the invisible strings. Vivian used the most public space available and spent almost nothing, just a sentence to by herself leverage. Madeline's mind was racing now. You could see it in the way she swallowed, in the way her shoulders squared. Was staying quiet dignity, or was it surrender? If she spoke, would she look defensive? If she didn't, would the implication harden into fact? These are impossible calculations to make while standing at an altar, being watched by people who expect grace, not resistance. And here's the imbalance no one talks about. The bride is expected to absorb discomfort for the sake of the day, to smile through it, to protect the atmosphere, even when she's the one being cut. That expectation is expensive. It costs pride. It costs safety. It costs the right to say, this isn't okay. Vivian was counting on that cost. Counting on Madeline paying it quietly. The ritual moved forward, but something essential had already shifted. The room no longer belonged to celebration, it belonged to anticipation. Everyone felt it. This wasn't over. It couldn't be, because when someone uses silence as a weapon, the only thing that disarms it is a voice willing to break the rules. And Madeline was running out of time to decide whether she was willing to do that. By then, the silence wasn't just awkward, it was accusatory. It sat between Madeline and everyone else, like an unpaid debt, growing with interest the longer it went unaddressed. She understood it now. Not the content of the secret, but its function. There was something being held above her, something everyone else was allowed to imagine freely while she stood there unarmed. And the worst part, no one was going to interrupt the ritual to save her from it. I watched her breathing change, shallow at first, then steadier, as if she were forcing herself not to break the moment open. Was that strength, or was it compliance, dressed up as grace? How long is a person expected to endure public suspicion before dignity demands a response? The room had shifted into judgment mode. Not overt, not cruel in obvious ways, but subtle. A tilt of the head. A whispered breath quickly swallowed. People weren't asking what Vivian meant anymore. They were asking what Madeline had done. That's how insinuation works. It transfers the burden of explanation onto the person with the least power to defend themselves. Thomas stood beside her, still facing forward, still quiet. I remember wondering what he thought silence meant in that moment. Protection, neutrality, or habit. When one person controls the narrative, everyone else becomes an extra unless they intervene. An intervention in a space like that carries consequences. Madeline realized something, then something heavy, something final. The secret, whatever it was, already existed publicly. It didn't matter if it was true or false. It had been released like ink into water, and no amount of smiling would clear it. Remaining silent wouldn't preserve the ceremony, it would confirm the implication. I've seen couples survive storms because they chose clarity over comfort. I've also seen people lose themselves trying to preserve an image that was already cracked. Madeline was standing at that exact crossroads. Speak and shatter the illusion of a perfect day. Stay quiet and accept a story being written about her without her consent. The altar is supposed to be a place of protection. In that moment, it felt more like a witness stand. Madeline lifted her chin, not to speak yet, but to decide. And I knew, watching her, that whatever came next would change the trajectory of the day entirely. Some choices don't announce themselves loudly. They settle in, irreversible, and wait for the right second to be spoken aloud. That second was coming. By the time the officiant tried to move the ceremony forward, the ritual was already hollow. The words continued, but they landed without weight, like coins dropped into a well that no longer echoed. Everyone was listening for something else now, not vows, not promises, an explanation. Or at least a crack in the silence big enough to breathe through. The celebration had lost its authority, replaced by an unspoken question no one could stop asking. Madeline understood it before anyone else did. You could see it in the way her stillness changed, from endurance to awareness. The silence wasn't neutral, it wasn't protective, it was an instruction. Be quiet, absorb this, let it pass. Let her control the memory of your wedding. And that realization altered her permanently. Because once you see silence as a weapon, you can never pretend it's harmless again. The choice had already been made for her. Either accept humiliation as the price of peace, or disrupt the performance and reclaim herself. There was no third option, no graceful escape. Vivian still hadn't moved. Still hadn't softened. That was the final confirmation. This wasn't about concern, it wasn't about family, it was about authority of reminding a grown woman in front of a full church that her place was conditional. The imbalance was complete. One sentence from Vivian had outweighed months of planning, thousands of dollars, and every promise embedded in that ceremony. That's the thing about power, when it's used publicly, it feeds on witnesses, and it dares the victim to either accept the role assigned to them or reject it at a cost. Madeline stood there knowing that whatever she did next would follow her forever. If she stayed silent, this moment would be remembered as the day something was wrong with the bride. If she spoke later, privately, it would sound defensive. The altar had become the only place where truth still had leverage. I remember thinking, this wedding will never go back to what it was supposed to be, but it might become something else. Something honest, something earned. The celebration was over, even though the ceremony hadn't ended, and everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, was waiting to see if Madeline would accept the role Vivian had written for her, or tear the script apart in front of them all. The ceremony tried to recover, but the room refused to follow. I could feel it the way attention had shifted from the altar to the audience itself. People weren't watching the vows anymore. They were watching Madeline, watching her face for cracks, watching her posture for guilt. When a secret is suggested in public, it stops belonging to the people involved and starts belonging to everyone else. And everyone feels entitled to judge what they think they know. Madeline's smile returned, but it was thinner now, strategic. The kind of expression you wear when you realize you're being evaluated and you don't know the criteria. She hadn't been accused of anything out loud, yet the implication hovered around her like a stain, only she was expected to clean. How do you defend yourself against something no one will name? And why should you have to on your own wedding day? Vivian sat perfectly composed, as if the moment had passed cleanly. That was the illusion she relied on, that time alone would normalize what she'd done. She let the silence do the work for her, trusting that discomfort would make everyone else compliant. Power like that doesn't rush. It waits for others to grow tired. I watched guests lean subtly toward one another, curiosity sharpening into judgment. The secret had become communal property. Everyone had a version of it now, and none of them were generous. That's the cruelty of public ambiguity, invites the worst assumptions and rewards them with silence. Madeline noticed it too. Her eyes moved across the pews, reading the room with growing clarity. This wasn't about resolving confusion anymore. This was about being weighed and found lacking, without ever being heard. The longer the ritual continued, the more the unspoken narrative settled in place. I remember thinking how unfair it was that she was expected to carry this alone. The bride, in moments like these, is treated like a symbol, not a person. Symbols don't get to object. They're meant to hold meaning for everyone else, even when that meaning hurts. The comment hadn't faded, it had multiplied. And Madeline understood now that waiting wouldn't make it disappear, it would only let it define her. The question wasn't whether the truth would come out, it was whether she would choose the moment or let someone else own it completely. Vivian believed she was winning. You could tell by how relaxed she looked, how easily she let the ceremony continue, as if nothing meaningful had happened. She didn't fidget. She didn't scan the room. She had the confidence of someone who assumes the rules will protect her. That silence would do what it always does, pressure the other person into submission. From where I stood, it was clear. Vivian saw herself as the keeper of order, the one who knew something dangerous and had chosen generously not to say it. That posture gave her moral cover. In her mind, she wasn't cruel, she was restrained. And restraint, in families like this, is often mistaken for virtue. Madeline felt the shift too. Not relief, never relieved, but recognition. She wasn't dealing with a slip or a poorly timed comment. She was dealing with someone who believed ambiguity itself was authority. The less Vivian said, the more powerful she felt. Every unanswered question elevated her status and diminished the bride's. I've learned that manipulators love situations where politeness is enforced. Weddings are perfect for that. Who wants to be the woman who caused a scene? Who wants to be remembered as the bride who broke the ceremony? Vivian was counting on that social fear like a savings account she could draw from indefinitely. But there's a cost to holding power this way. It requires the other person to keep absorbing the damage. And Madeline was starting to understand that the longer she stayed quiet, the more the story solidified around her as the problem. Silence wasn't neutral, it was agreement, at least in the eyes of everyone watching. Vivian glanced once, briefly, toward the altar, not at Madeline, never directly, but at the effect she'd created. The room subdued, the tension contained. To her, it probably felt elegant, controlled. Proof that she still mattered. What she didn't see was what was happening inside Madeline. The moment when confusion hardened into resolve. When endurance stopped feeling noble and started feeling like betrayal of self. How long can someone smile while being quietly discredited? And why is that endurance so often demanded of women, especially in public rituals? This was the illusion of control, smooth on the surface, fragile underneath. Vivian thought the silence protected her. She didn't realize it was also sharpening the blade. Because when power depends entirely on someone else staying quiet, the moment they decide not to, everything collapses. By then, Madeline wasn't trying to understand the secret anymore. She was trying to understand herself inside it. I watched her stop scanning the room and turn inward instead, as if she were measuring the weight of what she was being asked to carry. The confusion had burned off, replaced by something steadier and more dangerous clarity. Not about facts, but about intention. Whatever Vivian was withholding, it wasn't being withheld to protect anyone. How could silence feel heavier than whatever truth might be hiding behind it? And why did everyone seem so comfortable letting the bride be the one crushed under it? Madeline's thoughts were no longer racing. They were circling one brutal realization. Staying quiet didn't preserve dignity, surrendered it. Each passing second confirmed the narrative being quietly written around her. She wasn't being given time, she was being given a role. The one who endures, the one who lets things go, the one who accepts implication as her burden. I've seen this moment before, in different forms. It's the moment when a woman realizes the cost of politeness is being paid entirely by her, that the peace everyone once maintained is built on her silence alone. And once you see that exchange clearly, it becomes impossible to accept it without losing something essential. Madeline's grip tightened slightly around Thomas's hand. Not in fear, but in grounding. She wasn't looking to be rescued. She was anchoring herself before a decision. Was this the marriage she wanted to enter, one where discomfort was absorbed quietly to keep others comfortable? Or was this the moment she redefined what respect looked like, even if it meant breaking the illusion of a perfect day? The altar lights felt harsher now, exposing instead of sanctifying. The guests' attention pressed in like a tide. The longer she waited, the more the room leaned toward a conclusion she hadn't chosen. Silence, at this point, wasn't neutral. It was collaboration. Madeline understood that whatever came next would hurt. Truth always does, especially when it interrupts performance. But the pain of speaking had become smaller than the pain of being silently judged. And once that equation flips, there's no going back. She lifted her chin again, not in defiance yet, but in preparation, and I knew then that the quiet was living on borrowed time. The pattern finally became impossible to ignore. This hadn't started at the altar. It hadn't even started with that sentence. I could see it settling into Madeline's expression, the recognition that this was just the most public version of something that had always existed. Vivian's disapproval had never been loud, it had been strategic. Offered in glances, in pauses, in comments that sounded like concern, but landed like correction. Now it was undeniable. That sentence wasn't a mistake. It was a culmination. Vivian had chosen the most symbolic space possible to assert herself. A church, a wedding, a moment where the bride was expected to be gracious, composed, unshakable, and she had used it to plant doubt instead of blessing. Not because she feared for her son, but because she resented losing influence over him. I've learned that when people talk about protecting family, they often mean protecting their authority within it. Vivian didn't want clarity. Clarity would free Madeline. She wanted ambiguity. Ambiguity kept everyone looking to her as the moral reference point. Madeline saw it now too. The way Vivian's calm wasn't kindness, but confidence that she could wound without consequence. The way the comment had subtly reframed the marriage itself, turning it from a union into a question mark, was Madeline hiding something? Had she misled Thomas? The cruelty wasn't accidental, it was engineered. How do you smile at someone who just tried to reduce your entire relationship to suspicion? And how do you keep pretending this is about manners when it's clearly about power? The room had shifted again. People weren't just curious anymore, they were waiting. Waiting for Madeline to either absorb the insult or challenge the authority that delivered it. Vivian had underestimated one thing. Silence sharpens resolve as much as it enforces obedience. The mask was slipping. Not off Vivian's face, she was too practiced for that, but off the situation itself. The truth was no longer buried. It was standing right there, visible in the imbalance. One woman wielding implication like a blade, Another deciding whether to bleed quietly or stop the hand holding it. Madeline exhaled slowly, and in that breath, the game Vivian thought she was playing began to turn against her. Madeline reached the point where waiting stopped being an option. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No sudden movement, no raised voice. Just a quiet internal shift, the kind that happens when you realize the damage is already done, whether you speak or not. The humiliation Vivian had set in motion was active, circulating through the room with every glance and withheld explanation. Silence hadn't protected her. It had exposed her. She understood it clearly now. The secret wasn't being hidden to spare anyone pain. It was being used to suggest betrayal, used to undermine her credibility, used to place her on trial without evidence, without defense. And the most brutal realization of all this had been planned. How else could Vivian have chosen that moment? That tone, that precision. You don't casually destabilize a wedding unless you intend the fallout. This wasn't concern slipping out. It was control asserting itself. I watched Madeline's shoulders straighten, not with anger, but with resolve. She wasn't reacting emotionally anymore. She was deciding strategically. If the silence continued, the implication would harden into truth in the minds of everyone watching. The story would be written without her, and it would follow her long after the flowers wilted. The choice in front of her wasn't really about truth versus lies. It was about submission versus exposure, about whether she would allow herself to be reduced to a whisper behind her own back, or whether she would claim the narrative openly no matter the cost. This is the moment people think is about courage. It isn't. It's about survival, about refusing to let someone else define your character while you stand quietly and take it. Madeline wasn't seeking drama, she was seeking air. She glanced once toward Vivian, not pleading, not angry, assessing, and in that glance, the hierarchy shifted. Because manipulators rely on one thing above all else, the belief that their target won't risk public disruption. Vivian was about to find out how wrong that belief was. By the time Madeline made her decision, the silence no longer belonged to Vivian, it belonged to the room. Vivian still believed she was in control. You could see it in the way she sat composed, almost serene, convinced that the social rules of the ceremony would hold. That no bride would dare fracture her own wedding. That shame, once suggested, would do its work quietly. She was certain the moment had passed. But power built on silence always miscalculates one thing: how unbearable that silence eventually becomes. Madeline wasn't trembling. That's what struck me most. Her calm wasn't submission anymore. It was preparation. The audience was already leaning toward a conclusion, and she understood now that there was no version of this where she walked away untouched. The only variable left was who would be exposed. This was the point of no return. Not narratively, morally. If she stayed quiet, Vivian's implication would stand unchallenged, embalmed in memory. If she spoke, the ritual would break completely, but the truth would finally have oxygen. Either way, the ceremony as it was meant to be no longer existed. The choice was between controlled damage and permanent distortion. I've seen moments like this where people hope someone else will intervene. An officiant, a spouse. Time itself, but no one stepped in, and that absence was its own answer. Madeline realized she was alone in the decision, and, strangely, that made it easier. The room was already holding its breath again, not from shock this time, but from anticipation. Everyone sensed the shift. Something was coming. The silence had stretched too long to remain neutral. It demanded resolution. Madeline lifted her chin fully now, not to endure, to act. Whatever Vivian thought she had secured with that single sentence was about to be tested. And for the first time since the ceremony began, the balance of power stopped feeling fixed. Madeline didn't rush the moment. She claimed it. The room had gone still again, but this time it wasn't shock, it was expectation. Everyone felt the shift, even if they couldn't name it. This silence wasn't imposed, it was earned. And when Madeline finally moved, it was with the calm certainty of someone who understood that whoever spoke next would control how this wedding would be remembered. She turned slightly, just enough to face the room instead of hiding inside the ritual. That alone broke an unspoken rule. Brides aren't supposed to redirect attention. They're supposed to receive it. But Madeline wasn't receiving anything anymore. She was about to redefine it. I remember thinking how strange it is that truth always feels disruptive right before it arrives, as if honesty has to push through layers of comfort and performance to exist at all. Vivian still hadn't moved, still hadn't recalculated. She was betting everything on the assumption that Madeline would protect the illusion at her own expense. Was this really the moment Vivian thought silence would save her? Did she believe shame only traveled in one direction? And how often do people mistake composure for immunity? Madeline inhaled slowly, deliberately, not a gasp, not nerves. A measured breath, like someone stepping onto a stage they didn't ask for but were ready to own. The attention in the church sharpened. This wasn't going to be a breakdown, this was going to be a statement. The wedding had already become a judgment. The only question left was who would be standing when it ended. I could feel it then, the exact second when the narrative slipped out of Vivian's hands. Control doesn't announce its loss loudly, it just stops working. And in that pause, before Madeline spoke, the balance tipped for good. Vivian still believed the silence would protect her. She sat there with the confidence of someone who had survived decades by letting other people carry the emotional fallout for her. Her posture didn't change. Her expression didn't flicker. In her mind, this was the safest part of the plan, the moment where social pressure would finish what her words had started. Brides don't expose, brides endure. I could almost see the calculation behind her calm. Madeline wouldn't dare. Not here, not in front of family, friends, witnesses who would remember every second. Shame works best when the victim believes disruption is worse than humiliation. Vivian had built her authority on that belief. The room, however, was no longer neutral. Guests leaned forward, not out of curiosity now, but anticipation. This was no longer about a secret, it was about whether Madeline would accept the role assigned to her. The silence had shifted from control to suspense, and Vivian didn't seem to notice the difference. Madeline stood completely still. No tears, no shaking hands. That alone should have warned Vivian. Fear looks frantic. Resolve looks quiet. Madeline wasn't afraid of the fallout anymore. She had already paid the emotional cost of being judged. Speaking couldn't make it worse, could only make it honest. How many times had Vivian relied on moments like this? Moments where politeness became a shield, where other people's reluctance to cause a scene did her work for her. And how often had that worked because no one challenged it publicly? Vivian glanced around once, subtly, as if confirming that the room still belonged to her. She didn't look at Madeline. That, too, was a habit: never acknowledge the person you're trying to diminish. But the audience wasn't with her anymore. They were waiting for the bride. The illusion of safety was cracking. Vivian had mistaken stillness for obedience, composure for control. She hadn't realized that silence only works until someone decides they have nothing left to lose. And Madeline had reached that point. Madeline's voice didn't rise, it didn't tremble. It landed. She didn't start with apology or defense. She didn't ask permission. She spoke the way someone does when they're done being managed, when the truth is no longer fragile, but necessary. She said she couldn't have children. You could feel the room absorb it, not with shock at first, but with recalibration. The imagined secret people had been building in their heads collapsed instantly, replaced by something real, something human, something that didn't fit the narrative Vivian had quietly invited them to believe. And then Madeline went further. She said Thomas had known from the beginning that there had been no deception, no revelation delayed, no truth hidden from the man standing beside her. This wasn't a confession, it was a correction, and with every word. The weight in the room shifted off Madeline's shoulders and onto the silence that had tried to bury her. I watched faces change. Confusion gave way to understanding. Judgment faltered. The story people thought they were watching dissolved, and in its place stood a woman claiming her own history out loud, in the one space where it could no longer be rewritten. How cruel must someone be to turn something so personal into a weapon? And how small does power look when it relies on implication instead of facts? Madeline didn't linger on pain. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. The truth didn't weaken her, it clarified her. The supposed secret wasn't a betrayal. It was something she had lived with honestly, something her partner had chosen knowingly. And in that moment, the question was no longer what Madeline had hidden, it was why anyone wanted her shamed for it. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, it was stunned. Because the truth, once spoken plainly, has a way of exposing everything that tried to hide behind it. Madeline didn't stop there. She didn't need to, but she chose to, because truth, once released, has momentum. She made it clear that Vivian had always known Thomas was aware, that there had never been confusion inside the relationship, only outside it, and that the comment hadn't been an accident born of concern. It had been placed carefully, like a blade slid between ribs, where no one could immediately see the wound. You could feel the shift ripple outward. This wasn't about fertility anymore. It wasn't even about the marriage. It was about intent. About why a woman would choose her son's wedding as the stage for a calculated doubt. About what kind of cruelty dresses itself up as restraint and calls it family duty. Madeline spoke without venom, and that was what made it devastating. She didn't accuse emotionally, she clarified structurally. She explained how the silence had been engineered, how the implication had been allowed to bloom because it benefited only one person in the room, Vivian, for the first time. Eyes turned toward the mother-in-law in respect, not in curiosity, but in evaluation. The hierarchy she had relied on began to invert. Because manipulation loses its power the second it's named, and Madeline had named it in front of witnesses who could no longer unhear it. Vivian didn't respond. She couldn't. Any defense would require denying what had just been calmly laid bare that she had tried to humiliate another woman publicly to reassert control. Her silence, once authoritative, now looked like confirmation. I remember thinking how expensive that moment was for Vivian. She had spent years building an image of composure and moral superiority, and it collapsed under the weight of a single, well-placed truth. The same public space she had used to assert dominance now reflected her intent back at her. Magnified. Madeline wasn't asking to be understood anymore. She already was. And the power that had once flowed so effortlessly from Vivian's quiet implication had nowhere left to go. Vivian's authority didn't shatter loudly, it evaporated. The room didn't erupt. No gasps, no murmurs strong enough to interrupt the stillness. What happened instead was far more final. People stopped looking at Madeline for answers and started looking at Vivian for accountability. And Vivian had none to offer. Her silence, once strategic, now worked against her. It wasn't restraint it was exposure. Every second she remained quiet confirmed what Madeline had just made undeniable. That this had never been about protection or concern or truth. It had been about control. And control, when stripped of its disguise, looks small. I watched Vivian's posture stiffened, just slightly. Not enough to reclaim the room, but enough to reveal discomfort. The woman who had relied on implication now stood accused by clarity. There was nowhere left to redirect attention. The witnesses had already recalibrated their loyalties. Thomas turned then, not dramatically, but decisively. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence beside Madeline said what words would only dilute. The marriage Vivian had tried to destabilize was standing intact while her authority unraveled in plain sight. How often do people mistake longevity for moral weight? And how quickly does that illusion collapse when someone refuses to play along? Vivian had gambled on shame. She lost to truth. The humiliation she had tried to engineer returned to her, not through insult but through recognition. Everyone understood now who had weaponized silence and who had survived it. The altar, once a place of imbalance, felt recalibrated, not perfect, not untouched, but honest. And honesty, in public, has gravity. Vivian's silence remained, but now it was empty. The wedding didn't end the way it was planned. It ended the way it needed to. There was no attempt to rewind the moment, no effort to smooth it over with forced smiles or hurried blessings. The truth had changed the shape of the day, and everyone understood that pretending otherwise would only cheapen it. The ceremony continued, but it did so on new terms, stripped of illusion, anchored in choice. Madeline stood taller after she spoke, not triumphant, grounded. She hadn't exposed anyone out of spite, she had reclaimed herself. The dignity that had been threatened was no longer something she had to defend, it was visible, owned, no longer negotiable. Vivian remained seated, diminished not by anger or rejection, but by clarity. The control she had wielded through silence was gone, and with it, the power to define anyone else's story. The space she had tried to dominate no longer responded to her presence. I remember thinking how often people confuse a perfect wedding with a successful one. Perfection relies on silence, success relies on truth. This marriage didn't survive because nothing went wrong, it survived because something did. And the right person refused to absorb it quietly. The guests would remember this day forever. Not as a scandal, but as a turning point. A moment when a woman stood at an altar and chose honesty over comfort, dignity over compliance. The memory Vivian had tried to control now belonged to Madeline. When the ceremony finally closed, it wasn't with relief, but with resolve. The marriage began not under a veil of unspoken tension, but in the open air of truth. And that, I've learned, is the only foundation strong enough to last. In the end, it was never about the sentence Vivian spoke. It was about all the silences that came before it, and the one Madeline finally refused to keep. What seemed like a small disruption at the start revealed itself as a test of who was expected to bend and who was allowed to wound without consequence. Standing there, I saw the pattern clearly. Silence wasn't peace, it was control, and it only worked as long as someone agreed to carry it. I've learned that clarity rarely arrives gently. It comes when the cost of staying quiet becomes higher than the cost of being seen. Madeline didn't win by speaking, she simply stopped losing herself by staying silent. Some moments don't end perfectly, they end honestly, and that changes everything. That day closed a chapter the way it had to, with truth in the open and power, no longer pretending to be grace. If this story stayed with you, you're welcome to stay here too. There are other stories like this one, waiting to be told when you're ready to listen.